Well, good afternoon. This is my first time being a participant in GEM, and it's been great so far, so thank you for inviting me. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, we are a program that's been around for about 20 years at Brookings, and we do a lot of market, economic, social, transportation, land use analysis for cities and metropolitan areas, and as we heard, try to translate them into new programs and strategies and policies at the local, regional, and even at the state level, and even the role of the federal government in that. And my presentation here in a moment is going to be highly informed by a rich country framework, a developed nation framework. We do most of our work historically in U.S. cities, but we have launched in the last 5 years something called the Global Cities Initiative. And in that regard, we are doing a lot more work on analysis across the largest metropolitan areas around the country. And in fact, I had a team of scholars in Santiago yesterday, released a report on the competitiveness agenda there, and had the Minister of Housing and Urban Development with them. So increasingly trying to be value add to decision makers around the globe. So what I wanted to do was take a lot of the concepts about cities as economies, really, from the last day, and try to apply them to the politics and the political economy of cities, the sort of the political institutions and civic institutions that make cities work. This presentation is based on a paper I released a few months ago called Remaking Economic Development. It was aimed at taking all of these concepts that actually have been played out the last day to mayors, county leaders, transportation planners, business elites, civic elites, universities, and others, so they can create communities that are more prosperous and growing. And I got, by the way, one validation that I heard from the head of the West Cape Town Development Corporation in South Africa that really said this framework was great. So now I know it works in a developing context too. So first, one of the things that we want to remind our leaders is that in all this conversation nationally about a sluggish economy, about a slowdown in productivity, about rising inequality, that we need to clarify to leaders that there is a three-component part to economic success. You can't just do one of these. And this issue of growth, prosperity, inclusion seems so obvious to us. But when you look at the long-standing metrics and programs inside cities at the state level, it actually doesn't translate this. So for instance, we know that economic growth matters because we need to have an expanding economy that creates jobs and opportunities for people and firms. And when there are lots of jobs, there are tighter labor markets, which increases wages in those markets. But we know that economic growth itself is not sufficient. We also know that prosperity matters, and that is defined, we define that as rising productivity that improves the household incomes and living standards of our residents. However, if you look at economic development or traditional economic development activities, the U.S. is absolutely, and U.S. cities are absolutely obsessed with just growth and accumulation, more jobs, more people through mostly attraction strategies, and often recruiting from other places and throwing subsidies at it, by the way. But we know from the data that more does not always mean better, especially if the jobs you're bringing into the market are low-wage jobs, if the industries and jobs, the firms that you're bringing in are less productive than the higher productivities of firms that may be leaving the market because you've forgotten about them. So one of the things we want to remind people is increasing the value and productivity of your firms and workers, in fact, is more wealth creating than just accumulating jobs and job creation for job's sake. And obviously inclusion is about the extent to which the income growth you're creating from value-added industries, from globally relevant products and services, is being extended to more segments of your community. Not just being concentrated by the wealthiest populations, not being concentrated by certain races, in terms of making sure all people of color have access to that income. And we also have to think about in terms of place, that all that wealth isn't created just in the central business district, but in many of the neighborhoods that make up a city. So let's take a look at how U.S. metro areas are performing on these indicators of growth, prosperity, and inclusion. So we found that on growth, 95 of the 100 largest U.S. metropolitan areas saw their economies expand in the last 5 years. Clearly, we are capturing the most recent period following the Great Recession. And this counts whether you were a high performer like the Bay Area or a sort of a mid-sized metro area. All of these 95 places saw a positive uptick in aggregate jobs, in aggregate output, in aggregate wages. However, a smaller number, 63 metropolitan areas, became more prosperous during this period, meaning that they saw improvements in productivity, in living standards, which is output per capita, and average wages. But interestingly, just 8 metropolitan areas in the United States have experienced improvements in inclusion, such as better employment and wages for their workers. And to be clear, the improvement includes places that still saw lagging wages, but the wages didn't decline as fast as they did in the previous period. And these are places like San Jose, Salt Lake City, and Chicago are among that 8. But when I look at these numbers, 95, 63, and 8, what that tells me is growth is actually the easier part of the strategy, and productivity, prosperity, inclusion is much harder and therefore requires a lot more intentionality. And that's why, in many respects, we think cities are one of the most important avenues for solving these issues. As we said yesterday, cities are, they have to have know-how. So they are the units of the global economy. They have certain specializations, but they are the place of problem solving and very creative problem solving because of the collision of people that we talked a lot about yesterday. And so, we know that, for instance, it's whether semiconductors in Boise to bioscience in Boston, aerospace in Wichita, or telecommunications in Washington, D.C., all of these places specialize in certain areas. I think that's what I would just add to the conversation we've been having lately is that we're starting to see cities also specialize in technology capabilities, not just industry sectors. And those technology capabilities, whether it's big data, analytics, remote sensing technologies, they're having collisions with existing industries and starting to create adjacencies and new cluster specializations, which I think is helping to do the monkey to the tree sort of metaphor yesterday. So what are the strategies then that these cities, who are the engines of all these specializations and creative and talent and creativity, what are the kind of levers that they can pull to create growth, prosperity, and inclusion? So I'm going to walk through what we think is really important for decision makers and civic leaders at the local level. First, we say you have to be intentional. You have to set the right goals. More jobs, more investments, more deal in the pipeline is not going to be the recipe for prosperity. We need to think more broadly about whether or not your citizens are better off. What would it take if one of your key indicators was household income improvements that would change the strategies in your community? We also say it's really important to grow from within. Prioritize your existing clusters, your existing firms, and help them be more productive rather than focus on the firms that are outside of your market first. This means investing in a strong innovation ecosystem, focusing on that applied research capability, that skills pipeline, the modern infrastructure we've heard about that make a city economy sticky for the long term. We do say it's important for cities to focus on trade. I know there was a discussion about the skepticism about this, but what we are seeing is more cities are not leaving that up to national government, that they are taking a more proactive role for managing both the opportunities and also the negative effects of trade. We say it is important to invest in people and skills. Now, this seems also obvious for people who've been doing work in the city space, but what is different now is in the past, employers have relegated the role of skills development and human capital development to the educators and the workforce developers. And if that system was failing them, they would just blame them for not creating the skilled labor that they need. What we're seeing now is something different, is that the employers and the economic developers are now prioritizing and making skills development their agenda and creating solutions in concert with them. And as we know, if there's not a job or employer on the other end investing in training, opening up slots, there's no value really for all the workforce training you're providing in your community. And lastly, I want to say connect place. This is probably the hardest part of urban policy, and we heard some of that from my other panelists. You know, creating vibrant places, I think, has always been at the center of urban development. It's why we have great neighborhoods, why we have great downtowns, great innovation districts. But we know that too often there are many neighborhoods, as Raj Chetty reminded us, that isn't connected to the larger value and markets in the regional economy. At the same time, we hear a lot of people talk about regional clusters, but regional size solutions ignore disparities inside place. And so now we have to be much more intentional about how we connect neighborhoods and city plans to the drivers of the regional economy. And it doesn't mean putting all the factories into every neighborhood, but also mobility and options to connect those neighborhoods to those places. I am going to not go through all of these examples of places that I think are acting on each of these objectives. I can probably talk about them in the panel, but let me just mention a couple quick examples, because let me start with, let me talk about setting the right goals. I think if you walk into most markets, job creation, job creation, job creation is the primary metric for economic strategies. And what we are seeing in a place like Minneapolis-St. Paul, where the mayors and the business elite and the philanthropies all got together and decided to create a different set of metrics for success. They said, first, we want to have a % of population employed in advanced industries, signaling a commitment to global competitiveness. They said we need a % of the jobs that are family sustaining, so we're focusing on job quality. To tackle intergenerational mobility, they had a percentage of kids reading by age 3 and by race. And they cared about neighborhood opportunity. They said, how do we make sure the share of jobs, a good share of our jobs, are accessible by public transit? So that reflects the values they want to create along these indicators. And I'm going to close with one example, which is the one in Johannesburg. This is a city that, as you all know, because of the legacy of apartheid, segregated neighborhoods with black residents and townships physically isolated from jobs and services. That is a huge part of what is holding South Africa back. And so in one nonprofit found a study that the lack of money for transportation to jobs was the second highest barrier to the youth unemployment problem in Johannesburg. So because of that, the city of Johannesburg has now created a Corridors of Freedom initiative to connect and coordinate their rail and transit investments in a way that connects their black township neighborhoods to high residential and commercial developments. So I do think that cities can be not only the engines of growth and prosperity, but also the solutions to get to those great outcomes. Thank you.